Yes, I can hear you. But maybe you should speak louder a little.
One of the greatest challenges we face is gaping and growing disparities between countries and regions around the world. It requires bold and visible action by top leadership at all levels of society. We have to act. We have to act decisively, and above all, we must work together. The answer to turning around the devastating impact of this epidemic lies within us.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the virtual Vital Voices brought to you by the One Campaign and, of course, the Nelson Mandela Foundation. That video there of Dada explaining the massive responsibility that we have in upholding his legacy and the work that we have to do to get the continent to where it needs to be. My name is Naledi Muleo. I will be your host this afternoon. We have two interpreters. They are Andy Swake Bashe and Natasha Parkins. They are with us as well, and they'll be interpreting our discussions this afternoon. Well, let's get into the reason why we're here. We have a lot of work to do. You know, 2020 has certainly been the kind of year that has been eye-opening in so many different ways. The continent has largely been spared from the virus, largely from a health point of view, even though we have lost many lives. But the whiplash of this pandemic was massive from an economic point of view. Our economies on the continent are reeling as a result. This is what we face as a continent. 40 million people will be pushed into extreme poverty. That's just this year alone. 40 million lives pushed to extreme poverty. We are facing a massive debt trap on the continent. Our financial needs, according to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund at this point, are sitting at $1.2 trillion. That's for 2020 to 2023. Half of that money is going to be used just to service debt. That's just how much trouble we're in. And even understanding that very bleak picture, we still sit with a position where we see illicit financial flows bleeding through our economies across the continent to the tune of $89 billion every single year. These are frightening numbers. And when we talk about these numbers, we think of it as just corruption, and that it is just money being stolen or money being lost, money falling through the cracks. But if you go back to September this year, in our very own South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa called corruption, especially when we had PPE corruption in South Africa, he called it tantamount to murder. Because when work cannot get done, lives cannot be saved. So we have a massive responsibility here. To tackle corruption, we need to deal with it just as quickly and as seriously as we have dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic. And we can only do that, honestly, by working together and ensuring that there is a very cohesive plan to get us out of this mess. And we have to be warriors about it. So I am very excited about the program today. We are joined by real warriors of the battle against corruption on the continent. We have with us a Pan-Africanist and founder of the PLO Lumumba Foundation, Professor Patrick Lumumba. We have with us a former public protector of the Republic of South Africa, Professor Thuli Madonsela. We have the executive director of One in Africa, Mr. Edwin Ikworia. And of course, from the Nelson Mandela Foundation, we have with us Petronella Ngaba. And from all the way, speaking to us all the way from Nigeria, we also have with us Hamzat Lawal, co-founder and CEO of the Connected Developer. So We have a special message that has come in from Professor Lumumba. We're going to start that off. Just a quick rundown. Of course, he is an advocate of the high courts in Kenya and Tanganyika and a certified mediator. He is a fellow of the Institute of Certified Public Secretaries of Kenya and of course a fellow of the Kenya Institute of Management. Here's a message that he has sent to us just to kick off the program.
Permit me to commence my intervention by acknowledging the Mandela Foundation for organizing today's forum. Permit me also to recognize Mr. Edwin Ikwaria, who is the campaign director, and in the same vein, to acknowledge the presence of a warrior in the fight against corruption, Professor Thuli Madonsela. Many of us recognize that the 9th day of December each year is designated by the United Nations organization as a day for giving prominence to the fight against corruption, and is informed by the realization that corruption does affect the economic, political, and social life of a nation. For those who have long argued without success that corruption is a victimless crime, we now recognize as we walk throughout Africa that our agriculture, our education, our manufacturing sector, our health sectors, and indeed many other sectors are undermined because there are individuals in public office who use their offices for purposes of personal aggrandizement. Today is unique in the sense that we are commemorating this day at a time when the continent of Africa has been ravaged by the pandemic that has seen the continent being shut down. Africa has been shut down since the month of March at different levels, from Cape Town to Cairo, from Djibouti to Dakar, from Bangui in the Central African Republic to Freetown in Sierra Leone. And the truth be told, lives have not only been lost, but the economies have been devastated. Begging the question what it is that we can do on an occasion such as this to reignite the fight against corruption. The tragedy of corruption is that it is a cancer in our body politic, and that the many men and women whom we have entrusted with presiding over our public affairs have used their offices for purposes of personal aggrandizement. During this period, we have heard stories from different countries where those who are charged with acquisition of material meant to be used in the fight against COVID-19 have instead embezzled those funds. Stories have been told from Nigeria, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Uganda, and others. And we know that in Somalia, they have been as swift as to ensure that those who are involved in these dastardly acts were punished very swiftly. The question is, therefore, what can we do? Is it the case that those who are charged with managing public affairs in Africa do not recognize the negative impact of corruption? Is it the case that the African populace, at least the majority of them, condone corruption and therefore are co-authors of their misfortune? Is it the case that we do not have sufficient laws, or that if we have laws, they are honored in breach? The truth be told, in many African countries, we have no shortage of laws. What has grown in Africa is a culture of impunity, so that those who engage in corruption know that nothing will happen to them. We now know, courtesy of extant evidence, that many Africans who occupy public office take their money away to be stashed away in European capitals and other safe havens, and they deprive their societies of the much needed cash. Commentators are now saying that indeed all African economies will shrink. Of course, in order to humor a number of governments, they will say that there is some nominal growth. But a conversation with Africans in the streets of African capitals will tell you that the economies have been devastated. In countries where tourism was the main foreign exchange earner, there have been no visitors worth mentioning. The agriculture sector has been undermined. The oil and gas sector has been undermined. The manufacturing sector has been undermined. The education sector has been devastated. The health sector has been devastated. The net effect is that many tax authorities across the continent of Africa cannot raise sufficient funds to finance the things that ought to be financed for the sake of their countries. We who are assembled here can do two things. Number one, we can intellectualize, we can philosophize, we can moralize, and perhaps there is a case for philosophization, for moralization, and indeed intellectualization. But beyond that, it behooves us to make practical recommendations which will help our governments and our societies liberate themselves from the clutches of this pandemic. What are we going to do to ensure that this pandemic, which I dare say may be with us for a long time, is going to be attacked in a positive manner? How are we going to utilize the resources that we have so that they are available to address our collapsing health sectors? What are we going to do to ensure that we protect our education sector? What are we going to do to ensure that we protect our agricultural sector? And I'm speaking at a time when Africa had declared that the year 2020 would be the year of the silencing of the guns for purposes of ensuring that there is peace and tranquility to guarantee economic growth. Instead, what we have seen is conflicts emerging in different theaters. We know Mozambique is now under constant attack for people who are being described as Muslim insurgents. We know that Ethiopia, which is the seat of the African Union, is now going through a fratricidal war, which involved the central government and one of the regions. We know Sudan is with fragile peace, as is South Sudan. Eastern Congo, we know elections have been held in a number of countries which have themselves brought about instability in Cote d'Ivoire, in Guinea-Conakry, in the Cameroons. And these are things that we cannot ignore on this occasion of commemorating the Anti-Corruption Day, because all conjoined serve to inform the discourse that we are engaged in. My own prescription is that we should use this day and the outcome of our deliberation to engage government in a constructive way. I think many governments now recognize that if we do not fight the scourge of corruption, then the continent is going to collapse. There is no shortage of people who have written about this. There is no shortage of people who have spoken with passion against this. But I think one of the things that we must do include educating the populace. The populace must be made aware that corruption is not victimless. They must be made aware that for every shilling, for every rand, for every cedi, for every naira, for every kwanza, for every medical that is taken away by corrupt public officials, the health sector suffers, the education sector suffers, the infrastructure suffers, and the countries are the poorer because of these activities. Beyond education, we must also intensify the struggle to prevent corruption. Opportunities for corruption must be reduced by ensuring that we move into the digital space. which will reduce opportunities for corruption, so that corruption, if it continues to exist, is essentially the exception other than the rule. The third thing that we must do is that individuals who are found to be engaging in corruption must be dealt with firmly and swiftly. In fact, sometimes I dare say that corruption ought to be treated for what it is, a crime against humanity, because those who engage in corruption lead to massive deaths and other ills which bedevil the society. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow Africans, I have no doubt in my mind that we have the passion, we have the intellectual wherewithal, but the time has come that we must move from the drawing board into the hard ground of reality, so that we begin to address this particular scourge in a manner that is powerful, is directed, and in a manner that will liberate our continent from the shackles of these latter-day thieves who, as my friend Boima Fanbule once said, engage in theft on an industrial scale. It can be done, we must do it, and we must make our contribution. Let not the 9th day of December simply be a day when we remind ourselves of how effectively pernicious corruption is, but it should be an occasion for re-energizing ourselves in the fight against this ill. It can be done. I wish you all good deliberations in the knowledge that the ideas that are put on the table will be cross-fertilized and cross-pollinated, and ultimately the results that will come out of this deliberation will be communicated to those in decision-making places, so that they may be considered in the fight against corruption.
Those are very sobering words that we hear there from Professor Patrick Lumumba, essentially saying that corruption should be seen on the continent as a crime against humanity. And I hope that moving forward as a continent, especially after the lessons learned in 2020, that we'll certainly start to look at it that way. The theme for this talk today is viral corruption during COVID-19 and overcoming the corruption. Today we commemorate International Anti-Corruption Day, and the world observes it, but I think we need this conversation more than ever. A little bit later on, we are going to hear from the executive director of the One Campaign, and of course the former protector, the former public protector, Professor Thuli Madonsela. But before we do that, let's talk to some of Africa's bright young minds. I often say that in dealing with corruption, especially in South Africa, and I imagine it's very similar across the continent, in dealing with corruption, you need to start making it look uncool to young Africans. Because unfortunately, at the moment, we're having very difficult conversations with young people who see it as part of our culture, as what they have to do to become big. So we are going to hear from Petronella Ngaba, who is a board member with the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and of course Hamza Lawal, who is the co-founder and CEO of Connected Developer. Hamzat, I'm going to start with you, my brother, and ask, what is it that your organization is doing to have the conversation around corruption, especially with young people?
Thank you so much. Connected Development provides a platform for informed debate using granular data and leverages on technology too. We launched a campaign called Follow the Money. Follow the Money tries to answer where funds are coming from, where they're going to, and most importantly, how judiciously these funds are being utilized. With the award we won from One Campaign in 2017, we're able to accelerate and scale Follow the Money movement, and now have about 8,000 dedicated young people using their mobile phone to collect data, amplify this data, and document grassroots voices using hashtag and running campaign on Twitter and Facebook. For over 8 years, we've built their capacity and effectively tracked over $8 million in grassroots communities. During this pandemic, we've successfully documented and tracked over $200 million, both foreign and government resources that have gone into fighting this pandemic.
Brilliant work. Thank you for that, Hamzat. Petronella, if I come to you for a moment, what is the role that we play? I think we talk so much in South Africa about needing to have whistleblowers and needing to have young people that speak out when they see something go missing in their community. A tender is given to someone and the road never gets built. What is our role?
Yeah. Hi, Naledi, and thank you for having me. Just a bit of a correction. I'm not a board member at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. I work at the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and perhaps that's where I should start before I go into more broadly what I think we should be doing. So at the foundation, our work, one of our focus areas is around constitutionalism, and within that, I'm thinking about democracy building work, right? So you would have seen even last year for our annual lecture, we had Chief Justice Hueng deliver, the annual lecture and all around constitutionalism. And then this year we had the UN General Secretary talk about social contract. And for us, that is part of the core questions that we need to ask, right? Because corruption undermines the ability for that constitution or South African constitution or that kind of social contract that we have to find expression in society. And also for me, it seems as though when we think about corruption and public discourse, it's often very simplistic in its understanding, and therefore very limited in the ways in which it understands what our anti-corruption strategies ought to be. And that finds its expression to precisely what you were talking about. So in what ways are we actively building strong institutions, right? In what ways are we consciously thinking of what's the kind of social environment that makes corruption conducive and attractive, as you're saying? In what way are we holding ourselves accountable in the ways in which we think of our aspirations, right? Because essentially what corruption is the privatization of public life. So for me, what it will take is for us to firstly have a mind shift around recognizing the ways in which our own private interests are invested in the promotion of public life, right? A sustainable public life. Our CEO at the foundation, Mr. Sello Hatang, often asks us, in what ways are we acting today to ensure that we are in service of those who are not yet born? So for me, the kind of work that needs to happen, as per Professor Lumumba's call with his strong message, is precisely that. In what way are we returning the power to communities? In what ways are we ensuring that we have meaningful participation, citizen participation at all different levels? In what ways are we enacting a system of radical transparency? What does that mean for us? And ensuring that all these ideas, right, all these these institutions actually find expression in societies in ways in which we ourselves can hold ourselves accountable in the same ways in which we hold our leaders accountable.
Thank you for that, and apologies for giving you that promotion to board member at the foundation. Petronella, thank you so much for your response. I wonder if we need to, at some point, talk about how the young generation uses a specific kind of language as well to understand and deal with corruption, right? How often we, and I've seen it across the continent, where young people themselves join the noise that throws mud at those that are in the campaign for anti-corruption, where we demonize our own institutions that are essentially there to help us create that future. Hamzat, is that something that you see in Nigeria as well, where the voices of young people quite often are used to drown out the sensible conversation?
Oh, yes. Of course, we've seen a lot of campaigners, using social media tool and making a lot of noise on social media. And in some cases, we get response and reactions from government. In other cases, government go silent. But what we're now also seeing is a transition from activism to factivism, countering misinformation and disinformation and using social media to amplify information. So factivism have now been able to connect what happens on the ground and the kind of conversation the young people lead on Twitter, on Facebook, and bringing about the kind of change they want to see. And now that we're having conversation around building back better, young people have collectively agreed that to build back better, there must be comprehensive citizen engagement and citizen holding their government to account in utilization of public resources, both at the local level, regional level, national level, and most importantly, international level, as hopefully we get a vaccine that would be distributed as soon as possible. So yes, we're seeing, that conversation, and the fact that during the lockdown, a lot of young people were at home and they didn't really do much. So they saw that as an opportunity to even ask, what the hell is going on? And how am I contributing to the kind of world I want to see? 2030 is around the corner. And this year is a decade of action year. So as young people, they're embracing that decade of action, and they want to see themselves in the center stage, playing the leading role and using data, collecting data and sharing this data with the public, but most importantly, ensuring that decision makers use this data to inform policies and programs that affect them directly as young leaders.
Thank goodness for that. Thank goodness for that. That there is that moral drive in young Africans. That I'm telling you, that gives me a lot of hope. Hamzat Lawal, thank you so much for speaking to us. He is co-founder and CEO of Connected Developer, and thank you so much to Ms. Petronella Ngaba, a researcher at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. Thank you for your inspirational work. Let's get into the second part of our program now. We are, of course, joined by the Executive Director of the One Campaign, Mr. Edwin Ikweria. He is leading One's advocacy work across the continent. Previously, he was Senior Advisor to the Africa Executive Director with over 19 years experience in the development sector. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Ikweria. A good afternoon to you. From South Africa, we are joined by Professor Thuli Madonsela. She, of course, is a former public protector of the Republic, and she is also the law trust she's also the law professor at the University of Stellenbosch. She's founder of the Truma Foundation, an independent democracy, leadership, and literacy public benefit organization. Prof, a good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I think if I let you open, Mr. Ikweria, and I say to you, one of the things I touched on when we talked about as we introduced the program, of course, was just the massive amount of debt that we're facing on the continent. There is this fear that we are going to face a debt trap, and still somehow we're bleeding the little bit of money that we do still have. Just how bad is that situation?
Okay, thank you very much for having me today. And again, I want to welcome everybody. Africa is in a dire strait as we speak right now, because Africa is currently spending sometimes as much as 60 to 70% of its revenues to service debt that were accrued over many years, in a way to create development. But as we see right now with the pandemic, almost all of the revenue sources are drying up. Taxes are drying up. Those who rely on oil, the price of oil has gone down. The global economy is, basically came to a standstill. And so all of the revenue sources for African government, most of them are just drying up. But in the middle of that, they have to pay back huge debts that they've accumulated over many years. And so we are in a place where, while we are trying to fight a pandemic, while we are trying to recover, while we are trying to build back, we're trying to find jobs, give social protection for those who are losing jobs during this pandemic. In the same vein, we are losing as much as $89 billion annually. This is an UNCTAD report that showed up this 2020. 89 billion leaving the continent, and this is the contradiction to say, how do we lose so much, from the continent when we are still owing so much to the world? And this is the problem. This is why corruption stands at the center, to say, what are the enabling systems that allow money to flow out of the continent? What you have termed illicit financial flows, when Africa surely definitely needs this money for its own development. So this is where we are, and that is why the systems that enable this is what this conversation really is trying to tackle. The corrupt systems that allows people who are supposed to be taxed, people who are producing here, but they're not providing the kind of tax returns that they should be providing. They're taking this money out into safe havens, where production is not happening. And then we have people in public office who are also colluding to enable this kind of systems. And Africa is now a net creditor to the world because it doesn't have the resources it needs for its own development. This is the situation we are facing this day.
Thank you. Professor Madonsela, let me come to you. Edwin talks about these corrupt systems that we essentially have in the country, and to counter that, you need organized systems and infrastructure as well to counter some of those illicit actions, right? The infrastructure such as Chapter 9 institutions in South Africa and their counterparts on the continent. But I'm going to speak for myself and say that I'm losing confidence in the strength of the institutions that we have, and just how much teeth they have, and they seem to be losing even more teeth as we go.
Good afternoon. Do not lose faith, Naledi. I do think that we haven't achieved what we wanted to achieve. But firstly, let me just say happy International Anti-Corruption Day. And I do hope that one day we will, like a colleague I met in 2010 from the Netherlands, be able to say the biggest corruption scandal we had this year was somebody who stole money from a parking meter. At this stage, corruption is no longer a scandal, because it just happens every day and people have become almost insensitive. You ask whether we should trust the systems. I think that the mistake we make is to assume only the justice system should take care of things. For corruption to be handled, I think there are 3 enablers that we need to address. One is the social justice factor. I think it was Edwin who spoke, for example, about how the people are not engaged in the anti-corruption fight. Number one, why should I be engaged when even clean governance is not going to develop my community? Because the country does not have a very clear development strategy that looks at things ground up. So what's in it for me? Worse still, the corrupt do send a few crumbs to the people. And therefore, that's one of the factors that undermine the system. With regard to the institutions, Edwin and Prof. Lumumba spoke about the impact of money on politics. When there's corruption, money is shared between the politicians and the business people outside. And therefore the politicians that we expect to be part of the accountability mechanism, parliamentarians, party bosses where we have proportional representation, are not going to come to the party because the investigation into corruption is going to expose their own behinds. Thirdly, the systems themselves. There isn't enough transparency. We're focusing today on the problems around PPEs, for example, the corruption that has happened when we desperately didn't need it, because we would have expected that compassion for people would prevent anyone from stealing a cent. But just as people stole money after September 11 in America and stole money here for the funeral of former President Nelson Mandela, the corrupt have no principles. But what enables them is the lack of transparency. Imagine if we had a system like that is like the banking system, where it's very clear upfront what have you procured, and anybody can press into the system and know how much has been procured this month, what should we be expecting. We wouldn't discover at the end of the day that the bridge was not built. And you know about that famous joke about an African minister goes to one country and his counterpart says he gets 10% of the money and that's why he's rich. And then the African minister comes and takes 100%. That would be impossible if the systems were transparent. We've got blockchain technologies now that can help us to track whether the goods or services have been provided. Lastly, I think one of the reasons also we're not making progress, we make it an African problem. Corruption has never been an African problem. And even at the UN, the reason they have Principle 10 in the UN Global Compact is because corruption is a global pandemic. It's a silent pandemic. And even African corruption is not African corruption. It's global corruption. Who corrupts African leaders? Who overcharges us? Where do these illicit financial flows go to? If there was integrity in the world, why would a country receive money and keep it if it knows that the money has been stolen? And lastly, for me, it's the accountability factor. That I think we equivocate about justice, we equivocate about accountability. One minute we say it's all systems go, nobody's above the law, the rule of law applies, and then suddenly with some people we say different things. If I look at South Africa, for example, one political party has been handling a situation where they were asking themselves, should people step aside? In other words, suspend themselves pending an investigation. They say that's unconstitutional. But these are the people who suspend a poor policeman who scratched a government car on a trip. They don't blink before they suspend. So equivocating, and this whole thing of not really treating everyone as being within the law. And then the last thing I did indicate was the ecosystem spectrum. If we're anti-corruption, all countries should be anti-corruption, which means the rest of the world should stop having this parasitic relationship with Africa, where businesses from the rest of the world corruptly come here, overcharge here, and take the money out, and then they take platforms and say Africa is corrupt. The world is corrupt, not Africa.
Thank you for that. Very eye-opening. I appreciate that. Mr. Ikoria, if I come back to you and I ask you, what is the role that we can play then on the continent? And I'm talking about in how we hold each other accountable. We have regional bodies and regions and discussions, and I wonder if the problem here is that we're afraid to be honest with each other and ourselves on the continent.
Okay, I would say that it's not necessarily about whether we are afraid to be honest. The truth is that corruption has somebody, I think Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the former minister of finance in Nigeria, says fighting corruption is dangerous. So, and that is very real. And again, from Prof's point of view, I can tell you that if you stand and you speak the truth in that way, your life becomes you in peril. You should be afraid for your life because, like Prof said, corrupt people have no principle. But I think the key message here is that the society kind of has enabled it. Enabled in the sense that if the norm is that, or people expect you to be corrupt. So even when you don't want to be corrupt, but it is the expectation in society that you are the one that is odd if you're not corrupt, then you tend to play the same game. And so when you tell each other the truth, but when it comes to the nitty-gritty, so I'm driving on the road and I meet a policeman, and I want to insist that I'm not going to pay a bribe, and I get delayed, and I stay for 1 hour, 2 hours because I refuse to pay a bribe. And you will see my other colleagues who come and say, just give them this thing and go away from there, right? That in itself becomes systemic. And this is the dangerous part where our norms, begin to enable and embolden corrupt players. And this is where the challenge is. Talk about regional institutions. There are many of them. The board on the African Union body on anti-corruption, is driving norms at the central level. But at what point, at the national level, are these anti-corruption bodies really, taking on that whole comprehensive, holistic approach? And Prof talked about the issue of transparency. I would say, for instance, there are some governments that have launched, Fiscal Responsibility Act, and that has led to Public Procurement Act, and that is supposed to create transparent systems where everything you purchase is in the public domain, and by who is purchasing them. We have systems like beneficial ownership disclosure that are new norms that are coming into our corporate world now. These are the systems that are supposed to expose, politically exposed persons who are also doing business, with government, and making sure that, of course, the biggest buyer of goods and services on the African continent is the government. When you procure things, when you are engaging, giving contracts out, and it's in the public domain, then people can see, why does one road cost $10 billion here, but the same road costs $5 billion in another jurisdiction with the same terrain? Those kind of questions, that when citizens begin to probe those questions, that is when it now becomes a system. I will tell you this, when African countries come together and say it is a year of fighting corruption, the biggest system that was the conclusion in that is that we have to be transparent. And the simple reason is that this trust that you've talked about in institutions has gotten to the lowest ebb ever. Because citizens don't trust the institutions, they don't trust what they say. And the only antidote to that is being transparent. And that transparency in itself is what enables everybody to see, this is what the government got as revenues. This is what they spent it on. This is who got this thing. And that is the only way we will be able to drive a systemic change, that when we tell ourselves the truth, and then we can speak and say that whatever we are discussing, or whatever we are buying, whatever we are procuring, is really for the benefit of citizens, people can truly understand and trust it. Otherwise, the institutions themselves, just become, projects.
I think we're also at a point, Mr. Ikoria, where it's not just the institutions, and I think perhaps what we're seeing across the continent is that lack of faith in the institution happens because people haven't seen the institutions act. And by that I mean, we haven't seen a leader held accountable for corruption. And the thing is, we don't just need one, we need to see all of them. Now, Prof, you were part of a very interesting conversation in South Africa around how we deal with these leaders. Do we grant them some reprieve so that at the very least we say, let's have an honest conversation about what we've done, which is an interesting thing because I think truth goes a long way. But I wonder if Africans are just too angry at this point, that we want to see the proverbial heads roll at this point.
You're right. People are angry. They would like to see heads roll. And I understand people have been waiting for that better life for all for too long. From the moment Kwame Nkrumah promised people that if we end colonialism, your lives will be better. And in South Africa, when we promised people that when apartheid falls, your lives will be improved and your potential will be freed. And it's not happening. And people can see that through corruption, people jump the queue. So they're angry. And I was misunderstood when I suggested that some kind of amnesty should be given. I wasn't suggesting that it should be given to the big fish. I was suggesting that it should be given to the smaller collaborators. Corruption is a system. It is an organized crime. It doesn't happen without a lot of collaborators. And you can then pursue the big guys. And if you don't get the collaborators in the system, you might not nail them It's a very complex crime. I hear people when they say, oh, so-and-so got a peck of chicken or something like that in South Africa. People getting excited about who got what at the State Capture Commission. You still, in terms of the global definition of corruption from Transparency International, it is the abuse of entrusted power for personal gain. So it would mean that you have power, you have dishonestly used it to benefit someone in return for a benefit to yourself or someone close to you. And if you can't prove that, you can prove that I got the benefit, but you can't prove that I gave something in return for that benefit, then we can't nail you. And that's where then, if we have people in the system, they can show us the emails. If you look at, for example, the Trillion matter, for example, in South Africa, when I was investigating this matter as a power protector, Musilo, who had been CEO of that company, had been in at the thick and thin of things. And she had these emails that were showing that Trillion knew that the Minister of Finance was about to be fired. And there were SMSs that were saying, do this, a guy who's on our side is about to get on the saddle. And you can't get that unless you get it from the people in the system. And therefore, we do need to consider amnesty for the clerks, the administrators in procurement, the policy makers in legislation who can tell us who initiated a particular policy that doesn't benefit the people. We also need to protect whistleblowers. We all say we don't like corruption, but we treat whistleblowers as snitches.
I cringe every time I hear that word, snitches, because these days it certainly is being thrown around quite a lot. I mean, that's part of the struggle that I have with the culture around corruption, is that now we have the words, we have the words that scare you if you want to clean things up. Mr. Ikori, I'm going to come back to you and ask you I'm an eternal optimist, I'll admit. If you have, a few stories on where the glimmers of hope really are, right? The conversation we had earlier with Hamzat around young people wanting the facts and wanting to share information on online platforms, that for me is a glimmer of hope, that we want to do the good work, we want to do the Lord's work. Where are those glimmers for you?
Thank you. I think there are some systemic changes that we've seen over the past few years that I thought are potential. I mean, they indicate that somehow Africa is on track to, fighting corruption, systemically. I give the example of Nigeria. There's something they call the Treasury Single Account, or Treasury, the TSA, as they call it, where basically all of government finances, all of government revenues and co are domiciled in one account, so that every government parastatal, every government agency, has a single account. And then through a dashboard, you can see what is going on, how the monies are flowing out and how the monies are coming in. That is one glimmer of hope, where you can consolidate all of your revenues and expenditure through a portal. The only next level will be how that becomes available to citizens, right? And so they created something called the Treasury Portal, where the Supreme Audit Institution also shares and updates, gives information, on what expenditures are going out and how parastatals are using monies allocated to them. Those are, for me, some glimmers of hope. There is something that is also coming on right now called the Open Government Partnership, where African countries are coming together about, several in a multilateral framework to agree to partner with citizens, where citizens and the civil society as citizens, partner with government in designing what you call specific action plans, that enables them to deliver concrete commitments that can be tracked over a 2-year period in the national action plans. Those are glimmers of hope. There is the open contracting data standard that is also going on around. Some countries have adopted. Nigeria adopted what we call the NOCOPO, the National Open Contracting Portal, where the Bureau of Public Procurement continually publishes information about procurement that is happening in all the agencies, and people can then, the citizens can go in there to interrogate. Those are glimmers of hope. Those are the kind of systemic changes that we are hoping to see across the continent, where public resources and the way they are managed and the way they are utilized is available in the public domain. Budget data, the timely publishing of budget data, timely publishing of expenditure data, so that it's not just what is allocated, but also what is expended. Those are the kind of information that should engender trust in the citizens, so that when citizens know exactly what you're expending, that becomes, it's a lot easier to trust when you say there is no money, or when you say you are spending money. For instance, there's some laughable budget lines in national budget. For instance, somebody in Nigeria, I make the case again, they say we are paying for the presidential villa. We are paying rent for the presidential villa. When it came to the public domain, everybody like, how on earth should we be paying rent in the presidential villa? So those are the kind of questions. You cannot interrogate those things when you don't have access to the data. And these have been going on for years. So the more transparent we become, the more accessible data is to the citizens, the easier it is to follow the money, like our colleague Hamza just highlighted. You cannot follow what you don't know. And then there's the Freedom of Information Act that have been passed across many African countries that allows citizens to really ask or request for this kind of information. But the extent to which that is being implemented itself is also, has varying, level of satisfaction. But at least these are glimmers of hope that if you implement those, if you go further down, if these are taken to logical conclusions, it could really help expand the landscape for fight corruption on the continent.
I do want to sit on the issue of resources for a while, because I think it's important. We've heard the head of the NPA, the National Prosecuting Authority here in South Africa, talk a lot about just not having enough money to prosecute, just not having enough teams, just not having everything that she needs to be able to do her job. And that's going to be a similar case across the board, where the infrastructure that we have to clean up simply doesn't have the broom and the mop. Right? Are there innovative ways of ensuring that we equip our institutions, Professor Madonsela, without relying on the corruptors themselves to fund our institutions?
Absolutely. Well, as public protector, one way that we had organized for the institution to be funded was to establish a blind trust, like the Constitutional Court. But I understand that the idea was canned after I left. But not everything is about money. A collaboration between civil society and government can move the needle. And at the core of that is what the World Bank refers to as social accountability. If you look at the World Bank studies in countries where people have been involved in the budgeting process, in understanding who does what and where the money is going to go to, things get done and money doesn't get stolen, or it's rare that money gets stolen. And that social accountability is tied up with the OGP, the Open Government Initiative. Because where there is light, evil is minimized. And I think it was Justice Brandeis from the US who said, sunshine is the best of disinfectants. In my days as public protector, I've seen that when people know what standards should be met, who should do what, there's limited corruption. Secondly, where we can help government is bringing our own civil society experience in simplifying service delivery. My colleague mentioned earlier, for example, that when the system is complex, whether you're trying to get an ID, driver's license or a license, and a person can send you from pillar to post, people take the shortcut and they pay the bribe, which then contaminates the system, because then everyone pays the bribe and then it becomes a question of who can pay the highest bribe. But if the standards are made transparent, where you go to the police and you're a rape victim or a victim of anything, the standards are there on a glance, and we're putting them on SMSs, things are going to get better. So what would I say going forward? Where can we assist from civil society to make things better? It's social accountability, using technologies, innovative technologies such as blockchain, etc., to simplify service delivery, standardize services, and also make everything transparent. But the last thing I do insist, guys, is that if we don't make progress on social justice, we'll never make progress on corruption. Because if we want to make the anti-corruption movement fashionable, we need everyone on board. So one glimmer of hope, for example, is that young people are getting into the anti-corruption movement in larger numbers. There's always been young people, but we're getting larger numbers. But we need a tipping point of them, if I were to use Malcolm Gladwell's language, that we need a tipping point where it's fashionable to be part of the anti-corruption movement, where people can make a link between that 50 trillion, I mean, the Mbeki report said that in the last 50 years, Africa had lost 1 trillion plus in illicit flows. And some of it is not just this poor pricing, it's just people stealing money and putting it in Swiss banks and other banks. And 50 billion a year, if people can, if every Gogo Dlamini out there can make a link between not having schools, not having hospitals, not having bridges, not having roads, and everything that is going wrong with corruption, we'll get more of them into the system. But if also they can get the assurance that if we do collect this money, it's not going to improve the lives of the elites only, it's going to improve their lives as well. They're going to be part of the movement. But I'm very certain, like you, I'm an eternal optimist. I see change everywhere. I see people wearing orange overalls, but I see us claiming some of the money back as well. And pretty soon, it will be unfashionable to have money that you can't account for.
Thank you for that, Prof. And I think that is where I will release you. And I really thank you for those last few comments as well around every Gogo Dlamini understanding the impact of what corruption does in her life and in her community. Because essentially, what that does is it gives us a call to action. It says, let's have more of a conversation around it in our little spaces. So when that street is not built, or that building isn't built, or that work isn't done, we speak about it and we're not afraid to. Mr. Ikweria, I think I've got about a minute, but I'd love to get your call to action then as we wrap up.
Thank you for this opportunity to give a call to action. I think the main call here is, first of all, the word is integrity. You cannot be serving the public without integrity. If you don't have integrity, do not seek public office. That is number one. The other part is that if we do not work together to end this bleeding of the continent, we will continue to look to the outside world for help. But help is not coming unless we decide to help ourselves. Finally, is that it is transparency is the antidote of corruption. The more transparent we are, the better the systems to fight corruption, and the more trust we can have from citizens to be able to do that. So I really want to thank everybody. Prof, I thank you so much for joining this panel today, and I thank you for fantastic moderation as well.
Thank you so much. That is Mr. Edwin Ikweria. He is the Executive Director of the One Campaign. Thank you as well to Professor Thuli Madonsela, former Public Protector. We really thank Professor Patrick Lumumba as well for that sobering video that he shared with us. And of course, our young, brilliant minds, Petronella Ngaba, researcher at the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and Hamad Lawal, the CEO and founder of Connected Developer, doing wonderful work. Thank you so much to everyone who tuned in and for joining us. Keep the conversation going. As Professor Madonsela says, we cannot get rid of the darkness if we do not add light, and light comes from talking as much as possible. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. From myself, the One campaign, as well as the Nelson Mandela Foundation, have yourselves a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. I said thank you, everyone.